Kia ora and hello, everyone. Uh, my name is Chirag Jindal. I'm a visual artist, architect, and surveyor from Auckland, New Zealand. Grateful to be part of this festival and just would like to extend my gratitude to Pablo and Laura for inviting me in to share my work and for anyone joining in today. Um, uh, People often ask what I do. Um, like many, I still struggle with a single label. I'm a researcher and a media artist. I'm also, I guess, an image-based, I guess, storyteller. But the point is that I'm not a photographer in many ways. So my academic background is actually in architecture. So my gaze tends to be focused on our spatial and urban environment and the representation of urban space through new media. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so that you can see a little bit more of see the content as I go through it. And I'll just get you guys to confirm that you can see a black screen with a little picture and a bit of text. Great. Okay. So the project I'll be diving into today is something I've been working on for the last 3 to 4 years. It's produced using a totally different medium. It's still lens-based and it still uses photography in part. But the medium is largely a forensic instrument. It's typically used in archaeology and surveying, and also in criminal forensics. The instrument is known as terrestrial LiDAR. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and I'll dive into that a little bit later. But first, I'd like to just, I guess, just paint a bit of background about the context of the project and why I've decided to use this particular medium. I'm also going to go behind the scenes quite a bit. So just to note that some of the photographs you see in the presentation are purely illustrative and obviously not actually part of the work. And you'll see a clear distinction between the two. So the title of the work is Ngā Mahi Rarowhenua. It's a Māori title, which is the indigenous language here in New Zealand. And in English, it literally translates to the underground works. And it was a title gifted to the series, to the project, by a member of a Māori tribe, and is a reference to a karakia, which is like a Māori poem or prayer. It was in reference, in large part, to a Māori prayer about the demigods of volcanoes and the underworld. So the project takes place in Auckland, which is where I'm from and where I'm speaking to all of you from today. So it's important to get just a little bit of context about the city and about where this subject matter has come from. So where I live in Auckland, population of about 1.5 million people. It's built entirely on a volcanic field. There's over 50 volcanoes in our city, and basically what you're seeing here is an illustration by a civil engineer. His name was Ferdinand von Hochstetter. Actually, sorry, he was a geologist, not a civil engineer. This was from 1865. Anyway, so he was a geologist from the Netherlands. And at this time, the population of the city was largely Maori. So Maori were the original inhabitants of the country from 1400 years ago. And the city is built directly on top of this volcanic field. So it makes for a beautiful city, but one day, of course, it'll be a very bad idea. At the moment, what you can see in the image is in red the volcanoes, and in pink where all the lava flows, the ancient lava flows, emerge from the volcanoes. So this is what the city looks like today. All the white areas are the large commercialized, dense urban areas. And then everything else are all the suburbs, all the houses. So you can quickly see the difference between the two. You've got the big island, Rangitoto, on the top. And nothing's been built on that island, but that just gives you a little landmark reference for everything else. So from the early 1900s, the city rapidly expanded and sprawled. Basically, it was around the early 1900s that a large majority of settlers from the UK mostly arrived in New Zealand, and the city basically expanded so quickly that a lot of these natural features were ignored. So many of the volcanoes were quarried to be used for roads and railroads, a decision that is now fairly regretful. Um, and underneath some of those lava flows that you saw earlier, these naturally occurring phenomenon called lava caves. Now, lava caves can be anywhere between 10 meters long to about 200 to 300 meters long, and 2 meters wide to 6 meters wide. Sometimes they're just small pockets of air, but they're unique to this particular region. And inside these lava caves, the earth is become still. It's become frozen. It's fossilized in time. So you get these ancient fossilized lava flows. So they're quite different to limestone caves, which form over hundreds and thousands of years. These basically formed in geological time instantaneously, and they're only between 10 to 40,000 years old. So fairly young as well in terms of geological time. So I came to know about a lot of these caves in this landscape when I met this fella. His name is Peter Crossley. He's basically an amateur speleologist, which is a fancy term for someone who studies caves. And he came to New Zealand from Britain in about 1950, and he's been documenting them for the last 50 years. And the way he's been documenting these caves is generally by knocking on people's doors and asking them, "Excuse me, do you have a lava cave in your backyard?" That'll make a bit more sense when you look at where these caves today have now ended up. So basically, what had happened is as the city expanded over the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, uh, a lot of these caves were either filled in, destroyed, or simply built over so that the entrances now exist in private backyards or underneath street side manholes. Generally speaking, they're hidden. They're not in the public realm anymore, and they're certainly not in public knowledge. Uh, their entire history isn't really well known. It's not cataloged. It's not written about. There's myths and stories about ancient chiefs, ancient Maori chiefs who would use the caves to escape when they were warring with other tribes. There's also incredible stories of some of these caves that would go for kilometers to underneath the entire city to a different suburb entirely. Um, Often they become embellished over time, but the most troubling of narratives that have been lost with this landscape is that some of them were actually used as burial sites. So they're used as rupa, which is burial in Maori. And so bones were placed in some of these caves. Um, Sometimes they were either placed by the iwi, or sometimes they were enemies of a tribe. Um, it's again knowledge that has been passed down orally, but it's also not so accessible because these caves, after a certain point, they became lost to public knowledge, but also to iwi in terms of specific caves and specific locations. Um, there are still certain sites that are still part of living memory, which I'll go through in a bit. But these are generally how they now exist. They're accessed through pretty incredible thresholds. Um, behind garages. In the corner of underneath house foundations. Sometimes in street berms. And when you go inside some of these caves, they've got rubbish dating back over 100 years, usually from farmland, because a lot of the city was farmland pre 1900. There are lots of stories of the first settlers arriving on horseback as tourists and exploring these caves. There's also stories of some of the bones in the caves being removed and ground for fertilizer for the farms, and some skulls and bones taken back by the tourists as souvenirs. Obviously, nothing verifiable, but these are the stories that have lived on within certain people. Um, in a modern context, the caves are privy to basically the infrastructure above. So they now exist in this really uncanny relationship between the city and its drainage and infrastructure, and they often silt away. So it means that the ground becomes flattened, a lot of their features become lost. So when I first met Peter, he seems to believe that by the end of the century, none of these caves will no longer exist. And the main reason for that is because the city is now densifying. We are removing some of these suburbs and building apartments, and the protection that's currently around these caves are quite limited. They're not heavily policed, and the public doesn't really know about them. They don't really have much historical significance because they're not that well documented or known about. By that point, he had done some news stories over the years with the media to try and document these caves and bring them into the public forum, but they didn't necessarily generate much traction or much awareness or connection to this landscape. Definitely created some intrigue, but there was this. There's because the caves have not been known for such a long time. There's this very strong uncanniness about them. It's almost unbelievable. The rumors have also grown so that they become urban myth. There's rumors of caves that are giant, and there's giant caverns underneath the city, and they go between the different islands. And then there's novels and short fiction that have been written about the caves that talk about Wilberforces and these evil creatures living in them. So they become very fictionalized and very hard to believe. So this is part of the reason why we wanted to use this particular medium. So this instrument is called light detection and ranging, and the way it works is it basically shoots a laser, and see if I can load this video up. It's just a short video, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like inside the cave. So the way it works is it shoots a laser and it measures the distance the laser goes, and it does that about 1 million times a second. And what it's doing is it's generating a kind of a 3D scan, I suppose, of the cave or the environment that's around it. So that when you scan the cave, you get something that looks a lot like this. So this is what's called a 3D point cloud. It's basically a data set of millions and millions of points in XYZ space. So it's in digital space, and then you can move through the landscape as if you were there. It's obviously more of a measuring instrument, so it's quite I guess basic in terms of its visual quality at that point. But when we were first starting out back in 2015, when I was first experimenting with the stuff and using the scanner at the university, it was a pretty bulky process. The scanner didn't have a battery, so we had to plug it into a giant extension cable. So when we went into the cave, we had to basically have 100 meters of extension lead plugged into the neighbor's house, sort of thing. And we were working off the laptop on site. And the entire thing weighed 20 to 30 kilos. So hauling this thing through a lava cave that's 250 meters long basically took us about a week to scan. So it took a very long time. Nowadays we have this. So the most recent projects we've done, we've gotten our own scanner that we got funding for. And, we created our own little, these machines weren't really made to scan caves. So we made our own little plywood station or tripod, I guess you could call it. And we basically, we have to map these things from the inside. So, Peter and I often end up in these very intimate moments where we're able to chat about, I guess these are the moments where I learn a lot more about the history of the landscape. And, he shares how he came to, I guess, be involved in this and kind of become a steward or custodian. And he often shares a lot of these beautiful stories about runaway boys that are hidden in some of these caves, and communist printing presses that were used underground so that people wouldn't find out, and mushroom farms and World War II shelters. It's really beautiful working with him in particular. So I'm going to jump a little bit into. I guess I'm going to go straight now into the actual works of the project, and talk a little bit more about the output and the particular I guess the medium and the aesthetic, and why we've chosen to use it, why I've chosen to use large format works and 2D works as opposed to 3D works. So in the end, the idea was to try and essentially create a forensic image, a scientific image in some way. A lot like what photography used to be, in a way to furnish evidence. And the other part of it was also to really explore this uncanny but very real relationship between the surface, the city, the urban realm that everyone is familiar with, and then this unknown landscape that's no less than a meter or 2 meters underneath. And so it's really important for us to bring some of that the familiar typologies of the urban villas and suburban parks and kind of the suburban realm into these images. So the first thing to point out is that these images they're basically made up of millions and millions of points. So when we zoom into a small portion of even just that little bit of fence there, all of that is made up of individual points. And this is quite important because the image is each one of these points has been measured. It's been measured by a laser in some ways, and it's a forensic data set. So by kind of expounding or expressing this landscape in this way through this particular format, you're trying to produce something that's impartial or provide proof of this relationship, of this thing, that it's actually real. Often because these myths have over fictionalized this landscape, and it's part of the challenge of talking about this landscape with someone is that you have to show them and you have to bring them into the site to really get them to believe that they're real. And that's not necessarily possible. It's not possible to bring the wider city into this landscape because of the way they're accessed, because they're in private property, because the thresholds are really small and tight and they're hard to get into. And so it was about trying to bring this landscape to the public forum as opposed to the other way around. So this particular image is quite a powerful one because it details a lot of, I guess, a lot of the dilemmas and circumstances that currently surround this landscape. So this is one that actually starts in a private backyard, but then it runs directly underneath the road and then onto the other side of the road. And what we're looking at is a really deliberate, I guess, a collapsed section, I guess you could call it. It's a section of the 3D data set, but one where all the data, both in front and behind the section line, are collapsed onto a single plane. So you're getting all the information at once. So the surface becomes kind of this collage of everything that's happening spatially in front and behind the section line. And you get within this image all kinds of suburban paraphernalia. So you're getting all these familiar typologies and tropes. And the scene is exactly as it is. You're not crafting the scene. You're documenting it as it was in that particular moment. So one of the things to, I guess, talk about here in terms of the treatment, the aesthetic treatment, I suppose, of the image and what comes out and the process is these. It looks quite luminous, especially in the cave. You get these quite, I guess, bright and dark points, and the bright points are actually where we had placed the scanner. And the real reason they seem bright is actually because the points around the scanner are a lot more dense. Because if you think about what the scanner is doing, it takes about 5 minutes to scan, but if you collapse that into a single moment in time, then it's basically shooting out a sphere of points. And the surfaces that are closer to the scanner are going to pick up more of those points versus the surfaces that are further away. And so you get these. It's quite a critical part of creating an image that has depth, because then you start getting shadows and you start getting this kind of gradient of distance and things that are closer. in this section, which exists directly underneath the road, you can make out on either side of the image, you can make out how the cave actually continues all the way across. So it's actually flat, but directly underneath the road, when the road builders built the road, they discovered the cave and then they decided to fill it in with rubble. And so there's this kind of evidence of that, directly relating to what's above. And when we were working in here, when we were scanning, first of all, these spaces are incredibly tight. They're about 1 meter to two, well, less than that, half a meter in diameter. So you're kind of squeezing through. But whenever you hear a car, whenever you do get a car or truck going over you, the ground does shake a little bit, and it's a little bit nerve wracking. Of course, it's safe because it's all basalt, which is quite a strong rock. And then towards the end of the cave, you get these rubbish dating back over 50 years, 60 years, all sorts of candy wrappers and anything you can imagine, because of this one overflow drain in the middle. So that drain, which links up to the road, is an overflow drain when there's stormwater running down the channel, and it all flows into the cave. And that's what's actually ruined a lot of the geological features at the bottom. You can actually make out the team here. So after we had finished scanning the cave, we decided Peter wanted to figure out if the cave actually linked up to the surface via the drain. So obviously, being a caver, they love tight spaces. So he decided that he would try and crawl himself out. And then our heads were popped out of the drain, and then there was a man walking past, and he said, "Where the hell have you just come from?" And turns out he was actually the neighbor who owns one of the houses that exists over the cave, but he had no idea that the cave even existed. And so many of these people don't know, even though their houses are, a meter or 2 meters above them. The foundations of their houses are built directly into the cave. So that's us sitting down, chatting with him while we were finishing up our last scan, immortalized into the scan. And this is that same cave, but now we're looking at a cross section of that same area. So because it's a 3D data set, the idea is that you can look at it in whichever way you want to, which, it introduces the second mode of curation and creation, because in photography, often the first and primary mode of creation is in situ, when you're actually on site and you're documenting and you're trying to figure out the angle and the framing and the focal lens, et cetera. Whereas in this, you've got two modes. You've got one, the mode where you actually document it in real life, in situ, and then the digital realm, which becomes quite a critical part of the process, because then you're deciding, well, how do I actually portray the story here, the narrative? So now we're looking at that same cave and cross section. This is one that was basically just discovered in 2017, and we were called out to document it by the local government. The only reason we were called out to scan this cave is because the people that came across it were the local government. Most people, developers who come across the caves, usually when they're digging up for their pool or for a new house, they don't report it. And the reason they don't report it is because if it's an archaeological site, then they may not be able to build what they want to build, or it's going to cost them a lot of money and at least a lot of delays. So there's not much incentive for people to report these caves. And that often means that it gets filled in, which, you'll see in a lot of these sites. I mean, the caves that I'm showing here are the ones that have survived, that have remained to some degree because of peculiar circumstances, but most of them have not. And any evidence of how they've been used has been lost over time. So this one in particular, though, this one's quite uncanny and does still have a little bit of a little few traces of what it's been used for or how it's been imagined. So this is actually behind a street front garage. So whoever built the house and the garage on the street knew about the cave, and this would have been back in the 20s and 30s, because the current owners have absolutely no knowledge about this. But they will open up. When you go to the back of the garage and you open up a sliding door and you slide it to the left, and lo and behold, there's a large lava cave behind the garage. And so, who knows what kind of things went down there. But they've got this one thing that does remain in there is this old World War II water tank. You can see a little shade of it here. And there's rumors that the cave was used as an air raid shelter. Um, Obviously, it was never used because in Auckland we were never under threat of any kind. But it was planned to be used as such. I don't know if that was by the city council or if it was by just the local owners, but there was some really interesting traces of that in there. This one was heavily changed and modified, and there was explosives used to widen the cave and flatten it out, and there's a tunnel that was built into the cave, a little shaft into the backyard of this property. And these images are all proportional, they're all orthographic, and so when you look at the scale of the house and you look at the scale of the cave, they're directly proportional, meaning you can fit the entire house into this cave. um, Nowadays the kids use it for a bit of fun. They jump in there and they play around, but it's kind of I guess it's kind of tricky. They we don't know if some of these caves were used for burial sites. They could be quite wahi tapu, quite sacred. um, and part of this project is trying to build some of that knowledge back up and trying to regain some of that knowledge through conversations with the local iwi, the local Maori tribes. um, it's also used for Halloween decorations and Halloween, apparently. So we're walking around in here, and there was a little shed out the back, and it was full of Halloween decorations. So imagine that a lot of the trick or treaters go into here. So this is kind of modern interpretation of these landscapes. This one here is in particular has been pretty well preserved, but in large part because the owners of this house, I mean, this is in a fairly affluent suburb, um, but these guys owned the house next door, and then the property with the cave went on the market. They bought the property, they subdivided it, sold the house in front, and then they decided to landscape the back. So they turned it into this feature grotto, complete with concrete stairs and railings, and um, you know they flatten the ground, and they set up lighting in there as well. So it's become this kind of an extension of their backyard, but it also runs underneath, 3 or 4 different properties. Um, Above this particular area in here is where that existing house is, and this large rubble heap that you see isn't basalt, so it's not lava stone. It's actually all construction rubble, and it's been there for the last 50 years. So at some point that house was built, and a lot of this rubble was dumped directly into the cave. And this is happening in a lot of situations where people might find a hole of some kind in the ground, and it's a bottomless hole. So naturally, they dump anything they can in there. Seems to be um, a natural inclination. Um, this is the second largest cave in the entire city, in the entire isthmus, and this is Stewart's Lava Cave, which was formed from 2 different volcanic eruptions and lava flows, and that's why you get this multi-story thing going on. And the largest chamber here, the cave is over 7 meters high and 6 meters wide. So absolutely massive, huge lava cave, and it runs underneath 6 or 7 different properties. And so, there's also this question of ownership or guardianship, custodianship. In New Zealand, we have a term called kaitiaki, which means stewardship. And there's this question of who actually manages these sites, or who actually looks after them. Some of these more well-known ones, it's usually the owners at the entrance of the cave, who tend to install gates, and kind of have to suffer, trespasses of people who do know about them, teenagers often, who leave around rubbish and beer cans, but also a whole bunch of other things, condoms, etc. Um, this particular one was used as a mushroom farm in the 50s, but it has been well known to have been used as a burial site. So it's quite wahi tapu. And there's a story that the bones were removed at some point. So whether or not it still retains its wahi tapu status is well, it's really kind of it's up to the iwi. Some iwi see these landscapes as still a living part of the underworld, and still a very significant cultural taonga treasure. Um, This is actually quite a funny one. So this was one where basically Peter, a lot of the time when we go and document these sites, Peter knows about these caves. He knows where they are, and he'll say, "We are going to Pahia Road today," or "We are going to One Tree Hill today," and I'm just there for the ride, you know. And he'll take me to a location and say, "Well, this is where the cave is," and there's all manners of entrances. There's obviously, you know, as you've seen, the manholes, and there's garages and private backyards, and you know, big holes in public parks. But this was probably the funkiest one that I've seen. He took me to a road berm and he said it's right behind the flax. And this time I just absolutely could not believe him because there was nothing there. And he starts to cut up the flax and he starts to cut up, a little bit of the bush. And then he basically spreads out the bush. And lo and behold, there's a really tiny man-sized opening. And then he jumps in and basically disappears into the berm. And, that's it. That's me there following him. And basically what you end up with is something that looks like this. So this is that same cross section if we're looking at the photograph versus the lidar, and then it then runs underneath the property, and we're looking at a cross section, so we're not able to fully see what the cave is actually doing, but it's actually coming out towards us. So it gets quite large, but this part of the cave is really long and narrow and tight, and there's a lot of crawling and a lot of fitness required in documenting these sites, largely because you have to position the scanner, set it off, and then basically crawl away as fast as you can so you don't get caught in the scan. These images, they talk a little bit more about the landscape that they used to exist in, these caves used to exist in before urbanization. And that's largely because these caves exist in areas within the city that are still reserved for public parks and sometimes still farming. So that gives you a good idea of what, I guess, the untouched nature of these caves are. And you can see that they're a lot more volatile, they're a lot more textured, and the image captures a lot of these textures a lot more in a lot more detail. And it can often make it quite hard to read the section. It ends up becoming this quite abstract interpretation of this, but the space within the cave. This particular cave was the one that was rumored to be used as an underground communist printing press back in the 60s and 70s. So that's basically that's essentially an overview of the the overall series or the works on their own. There's in total about 20 works, and we went through about 7 of them. But at this point, once I had the project in the works, there was a question of really how to expose the work and the landscape. It was important that there was a forum of some kind, because this landscape is largely unpublished, and we knew that when we were going to exhibit the work, that the encounter of this landscape through these images was it was going to be a surprise to a lot of people. And it was important to create a place where we were able to share the knowledge and the stories and create relationships as well with local Māori, as well as policymakers who work at Auckland Council. And it also had to be at scale. It had to be in a format that particularly worked with this medium. And in the end, we decided to basically work with light boxes. And a public exhibition made the most sense. And so we approached the owner of this place, which was a repurposed industrial building at the edge of the city waterfront. And it's quite a complicated space to work with because all the walls were curved. So basically, it's these 6 large grain silos. And with the budget we had, I basically had to design and fabricate a prototype light box, just basically in my studio and in my home. And we use this kind of modular build to create light boxes that were about 7 meters long and 1.2 meters high. And again, this was important because the scale of the work needed to be large enough that you can make out some of these individual points, and which that also came through in the the printing quality of the image, which was printed at 1200 dpi, which is the highest we could get. So you could take a magnifying glass to the image and see some of these points, and that became quite a critical part of the narrative of that particular, I guess, of this particular project, because again, it had to be this sort of impartial scientific image, and that point cloud, that point data set that's underneath, that underpins the creation of the larger image, was critical to that. So we built about 16 of these together. We built it just basically, Peter and I built it with a few of our friends. It was a very independent way of exhibiting, which I really enjoyed, as it gave me complete freedom in the show. And this is the only text that featured in the entire show. And this was a deliberate decision, because the caves were so unknown to the public, and there was really little that was formally published, and it was important to be careful that anything we said could be taken as absolute fact. And if we were starting to recite some of these stories or histories or narratives, then it kind of reduced the project down to this sort of museological interpretation. And instead, I really wanted the viewer to simply encounter the image as if they were encountering the landscape for the first time, to create their own relationship with it, and their own discovery. And then once they had become accustomed to that, then there was this opportunity for a conversation, dialogue to take place in person. So Peter, being the enthusiast he is, and a lot of his cave friends, basically manned the exhibition every single day. And they were around to talk to people, and talk them through the work. And so the idea was to blend this kind of museological exhibition style, one that was informative and educational, but also one that was, very deliberate, I suppose, artistic, and allowed people to create their own connection to the landscape. So it was a little bit unconventional that Peter was there, but this way he could engage people directly and talk about the landscape in an informal setting. And as you can imagine, Peter loved this. So we also had a number of private viewings with members of the public, but also importantly, members of local Māori tribes. So as I mentioned earlier, many Māori are no longer aware of the exact location of the caves, but there is knowledge that has been passed down through the generations. And so there's stories of old chiefs that escaped battles through the caves, of long underground networks that connect some of the islands to the mainland. And there was also many sites we didn't know about, because this landscape is so fragmented. So as a result of this sort of ongoing dialogue, we were able to form these new relationships, and build trust with a lot of the iwi, that allowed us to essentially, there was a couple of sites that we became invited to document, that would previously be hidden from public knowledge, and even from our knowledge, largely because only until recently they were still used as burial sites, and they were used as they were wahi tapu, they were very sacred. And so the process to document some of these sites, so this one in particular, which is a site known as the Ana Kawiwi, which means cave of bones, there was a karakia, so it was a formal prayer process, and a singing that took place outside, and we were accompanied by kaumatua, which are the elders of the tribe, into the cave in order to document it. And then the entire data set and the image was used as part of the local iwi's process to have the wider site recognized as a place of special historic significance. So the image became a resource, not only for documentation and archiving, and then also allowing people to connect and relate to this landscape, but also as a resource and a tool for applying for and winning eventually heritage status. So I'll end the conversation here for now, from my end anyway, and open the floor to any questions, and would be happy to chat about anything that anyone would like to know. Okay, well, if there are more questions, then thank you everyone for. Oh, there's a question there. Yep. Sorry, I can't actually see anyone from my point of view, but I can see a hand there. Yes.
Hello?
Hey.
Hi, I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Is the scanning such that it can be, I know this is kind of a weird question, but is it such that the files can be put into like a CAD program or to almost like a 3D modeling program?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. So there's native software suites that are particularly designed for this particular medium, point clouds, and it's typically used in surveying and architecture. And for that reason, you can bring it into pretty much all CAD software suites now. And the way that the images were created were within a digital modeling suite, and you can generate. Typically, these point clouds often form the basis for further works. So they're these kind of dumb raw data sets, and so the idea is that they're quite functional, and that you build these 3D models and line work out of that. But the point cloud as a medium, as an aesthetic medium, or as an artistic medium, hasn't been explored that much. There are some contemporaries out there. There's ScanLab projects in the UK. They've done some very exciting work with point clouds. And there are some individual practices across the world, but not a hell of a lot.
Right. So these caves could be theoretically like 3D printed.
They can, yeah. So that was actually something I did initially. It's kind of interesting. It's difficult because once you've got this 3D data set, one of the first questions was, what's the output here? Because once you've got a 3D digital data set, you can create a VR story, you can create a moving image narrative, you can 3D print them. There's a whole bunch of different outputs that are possible, and I explored each one. And in the end, the simplest and most effective way to tell the story and the narrative of this landscape was actually came back to these 2D images. There's a whole number of reasons for that. With VR, of course, you're limited to one user at a time. And then if you have to create this queue for people to use these headsets, then you end up with these sweaty headsets. And that's a little more practical front. But then there's also this idea that you're only conveying the story of being inside these caves at a particular point. But then are you actually also being truthful to what's really there? And if you're not being truthful, then why not just actually curate and create something that is deliberate? If in these images, the caves can actually look quite beautiful and quite otherworldly. In real life, they're actually full of rubbish, and they can actually be quite grotesque. And so there's this kind of curation to some degree in the images to portray them in a particular way, so that the first encounter of these caves forms an admiration, or at least a kind of connection or mystery about them that allows people to well, I guess the idea was to build some level of stewardship amongst the wider city, so that could inform public policy. And so the image became the best form for that. We did 3D print stuff. We hung it up, and then I looked at it and went, no, there's nothing that this adds that we actually need. So we 3D printed an entire cave and the surface, and it ended up being gimmicky. It ended up being, it actually removed from the work. And so there was this kind of process of actually going back and distilling back to the image. But yes, they can be 3D printed.
Thank you.
Hi there. I really enjoyed this presentation. This is fascinating. I'm kind of curious about. I believe I'm understanding your techniques for photographing underground. Are you using the same techniques to photograph above ground? Because I love the aesthetics between, they look so similar, and it feels like, you're providing this visual where you're really trying to connect, the above and below in an aesthetic way. So is it the same techniques above as you photograph?
Yeah, Yeah, it's the exact same. Yeah. So it's this process of kind of documenting in a single station and then moving the scanner, because the scanner has a line of sight, so it can't see behind anything we can't see.
Mhm.
And for that reason, you move it, and then you eventually end up at the entrance of the cave, and then you go in deeper, every 3 or 4 meters. And then there's this process called registration, where you essentially tie all the scans back together. So you form this cohesive, connected 3D data set that actually captures everything that's going on in one point cloud. But it's you get this quite different visual treatment on the surface, because the distance between things is so much further apart. And so things end up becoming a lot more ephemeral, a lot more transient, a lot more temporary. And it's kind of a kind of result of the process, or an accidental result. But in the end, it became really powerful for the narrative here, because a lot of these caves, which in the image are quite, they're very solid, they have been there for 10 to 40,000 years, but these urban environments have only been there for 50 to 100 years, and they're quite temporary. And yet that relationship is still fairly tumultuous, because these caves, which are actually quite both ancient and really strong, are at high risk of a simple bulldozer coming around and basically destroying everything that's been formed there. So it actually ended up capturing this really interesting dichotomy. Yeah.
Do above ground, does it have to be photographed at night, or can it be the day?
Yeah, this is a pretty common question. All the scans are done during the day.
Okay.
And the black that's there is actually just the absence of light. It's the absence of data points. So you do get this, nightly visual treatment. So, the image ends up becoming quite uncanny. The color is captured using photography. So the underlying data set is actually just black and white, doesn't have color. But then using photography, you can I overlaid the colors on top of those points and created RGB values for each of those XYZ points. And that's what you get on the surface. Below ground, there is no color. There is color, but there's no light. And so when you're underground, you're not really using, the cones in your eyes, using the rods, or the other way around. I can't ever remember. And so, when you're, it's really interesting, because when you're underground for 8 hours scanning and you come out, you're almost completely desensitized to the world above you. And so, not desensitized, sorry, the opposite, you're sensitized. And so everything is saturated. Movement, it becomes so much more lively. Colors and are so much more saturated. Smells, etc. It's like your senses are dulled for 8 hours. You're kind of like in this sensory deprivation chamber, I guess. And so these images, the above ground ends up becoming these like really highly saturated spaces compared to the below ground.
Wow. Yeah, they're aesthetically beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the questions.
Hi, I found that really fascinating, and I used to do a lot of caving when I was young, and I live in Bristol, UK, and apparently there's an underground lake there that nobody's allowed to visit, and it's under one of our big housing estates.
Wow.
And there's lots of caves in the southwest and Wales as well, and all around the UK. Limestone caves, not lava caves. But and I found the imaging you're using is quite amazing and spectacular, because I remember surveying caves the old-fashioned way, which took days and years sometimes.
A lot more skill and talent.
But yes, but I just wondered, now that you've sort of brought these caves into the public and built relationships with local people and found some of the sacred uses of the caves, do people want to visit? And is there an interest in sort of maybe cleaning them up and letting people visit them at all?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What is the future of this landscape now? Because absolutely people want to visit them. They're curious. Naturally, they would. And it was part of the first dialogue we had with Auckland Council when we were going to exhibit the caves, and with Peter. How do we document this in a way that allows people to connect with them, but then also sadly tell them unfortunately they can't visit the sites? And we had to hide a lot of the road numbers and the road names for a lot of the landscape. And I think it was one of those things where, you know, if you're really, really enthusiastic about wanting to find these caves, you would find them. But right now, the steps that have been taken have been quite minimal or incremental, I guess. The caves are now they're now protected by an urban planning framework, which is known as the Outstanding Natural Features in the local council. And so for any work, any kind of building work or construction work, anything that would happen where the cave is underground, it would have to go through a due process where they would have to engineer around the cave and make sure that the caves weren't affected in any way. But so there is that as a success story. However, new caves, because people still aren't that well aware of them, there's no policing yet or any kind of consequence for developers that end up basically dumping a truckload of concrete into these sites, which is still happening. You know, there was a larger redevelopment over in Alexandra Park, which is a multi-unit development in Auckland, and there were all these rumors of these truckloads of concrete coming to the site and filling up this void, and they called it a void. There was rumors that the council then pursued or followed that up, but what actually happened of it, we don't know, whether they were fined or not. And so there's still this kind of barrier for new discoveries and protecting that. In terms of visiting the caves, you know, the one that I showed, which was basically the owners that had built those steps into the cave, they had these once a year, they've got these open garden tours where they open up their backyard and people can come in and have a look. And it's not very well known, but still, I think they get 500 to 1,000 over a weekend. So they still get quite a few people through now. So there is that. But then there's also on the big island that I showed earlier on the corner of the map, Rangitoto Island. There's a number of these lava caves which are publicly accessible. And so if people want to understand what these caves look like, that's where they can go. And that's usually where we point them. But it's generally unsafe to visit any of these caves as a member of the public, because you just won't be well equipped, and it just wouldn't be as safe. There's a story of during one of those open garden tours, just as an example here, there was a lady that went in, and of course, as people are going into the cave, the owners count the number of people go in, make sure the same number of people come out, and they figured that one was missing, and they couldn't find her, and they had to call the fire department, and the fire department eventually found her through a crawl space on the other side, and she was in this kind of spiritual trance, and she obviously had some kind of spiritual connection with this landscape that she wanted to explore in some way. She was not tangata whenua. She was not Māori. She was, so, you know, it's kind of interesting, because then it's, you know, how do you police for that? And you know, when incidents like that happen, when there's an open garden tour, you know, what would happen if there's not? And how do you ensure that they're supervised in some way? Your last question, which was about cleaning up the rubbish, that's something that we're going through right now, working with iwi and trying to make that happen. It's going to cost a lot of money. One of the major challenges is that because the rubbish is so old now, that they might end up finding archaeological artifacts. And so now you have to get archaeologists involved just to clear the rubbish. Right. And so now it's become a lot more expensive, and there's this due process, and it's kind of, well, no one wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole now, you know? And so it's part of the reason why it hasn't been cleaned out. But the next step of the project is to culminate the project in a publication, and the publication will be heavily visual. So it'll be on the likes of a photo book with critical essays. And the idea is to then be able to, we had quite a few people come through the exhibition, and we know that those people told other people, but the idea is to create a publication that then lives permanently, and that then creates this discourse and dialogue amongst the wider public. I don't think Peter's been doing this for 50 years. You know, he knows a lot, but he's tired, and I'm not really capable of doing that either. So we're kind of putting it out to the public to move it forward, to someone else take the mantle, I guess.
Wow, there's a lot of issues.
Yeah. It's a complicated thing because
Yes.
it becomes so intertwined with the urban environment.
Yes, definitely. Oh, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks for the questions. Those caves in Bristol sound interesting, though, so I'll have to research them.
Hello there. First of all, congratulations for connecting this technology to something so culturally important. I've got two questions for you. One of them is I met like 5 years ago Petri Juntunen. He used LiDAR to do landscapes also, but not in this way, in some kind of a different one. And that time I was also considering using them, but those 5-6 years ago they were so unavailable, so expensive, used only by scientific organizations which he was part of, so he could acquire one. Did it got better? Is it more accessible now? And the second thing would be, as I didn't look into this field for a very long time, you mentioned some other artists working with it. I would be pretty interested in them also, seeing what have been done in this field in general.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it's kind of like, I guess it's akin to photography when it first became a medium for documentation. Pretty inaccessible, very expensive. These machines end up costing between 50 to 100K. The initial one we used, I was quite lucky. I was studying architecture at the university, and they just got a scanner in from the Department of Anthropology, and they had a little a session for anyone who was interested in learning how to use it, and they put the call out to the entire department, and me and one other person turned up, and then no one else needed it the next year. So I was lucky to just borrow it for an entire year, which was crazy. So I had the luxury of being able to play with it. But that was back in 2015, when, as you say, the machines were quite expensive. I mean, to rent them out for a single day would cost about $1,500. So you'd have to have some pretty big budgets. Today, a lot of that hasn't changed, in that if you still want to use a LiDAR scanner, it's still going to set you back about $800 a day. This is New Zealand dollars, so about $500 a day to rent it out. They're a lot faster now, a lot more mobile, so you can do a lot more with them. I run a practice where we've purchased 2 of these scanners, so we've got more access to them now. We're doing quite a few other projects with them now. We're doing one in Lithuania, starting one in Santiago as well. But the most accessible way you can work with this medium is through a process called photogrammetry. So photogrammetry is basically a process that uses overlapping photographs to create point clouds. The point clouds have a completely different treatment, or I guess, but it's a lot more accessible, and the colors are a lot richer. And so you can create these incredibly vivid animations that take you through the space. And they're, again, you can do that with your smartphone or your DSLR camera. There's obviously limitations of range as well. You can't really, document large landscapes using a DSLR. You're going to have to work with, these expensive machines. But if you sorry, go on.
Mainly used for landscape scanning. I'm aware of, yeah. And you can use like any camera for it, but the output from the LiDARs is pretty different and pretty specific. And this point of view, or the view from one point to the whole scene, is pretty unique thing, which is very hard to achieve with photogrammetry, because you're taking it from different points. So I was specifically interested in LiDAR.
Yeah. And I think it's also a conceptual part of it as well, because with LiDAR as a precision instrument, it's, especially machinery we're using, it's documenting to a precision of 1 millimeter. And so you're picking up detail, but there's also this idea that what you're seeing is undoctored, you know, it's evidence in some way. You know, they use this machine for criminal forensics. And, you know, photography has kind of lost an element of that. Obviously, it still has that in a lot of different ways, but you know, in the post, I guess in the post photography era, or an era where we can document these images so quickly and easily, you know, it's not necessarily as evidential as it used to be. So using LiDAR is a kind of, you know, a new way to do that, I guess. In terms of practices that use this really effectively, I think the guys at ScanLab Projects, so there's two of them, Matthew Shaw and William Trussell, and they're also graduates of architecture, but they started playing with this stuff back in 2010, so a long time ago, and they've gotten really apt at it. You know, they're the ones who've been scanning, you know, the underground caves over in Rome, and you know, Naples, and all sorts of interesting places. They scan Pompeii, and they do a lot of work for BBC. They also do some individual creative projects and slightly more critical projects. They've recently done this really interesting time-lapse work where they documented a lot of landscapes across the UK. So one of them was the dunes that were shifting, and they used LiDAR every single day and basically created this animation through digital space, but changing the data sets every day so that you get this time lapse of the dunes moving in and out. Just as an example, so they're really pushing the boundary of how this stuff can be used, and they've used it to create these 3D models for ice flows as well, and molds and things like that. So you kind of go beyond the image. They go beyond the image as well. I think the other people that I do know who are using it, as far as I understand, their practices aren't necessarily formally established. These are obviously the practices that I do know. A lot of them are individual artists. There's also Stephen Giro, who's a professor at ETH Zurich, and he does stuff with landscapes. I think it's interesting because, you know, when this medium is so, I guess as a kind of as an artistic medium, it's fairly new, it's fairly novel. And so as a result, you know, initially, I think it's quite easy to get to fall under the, you know, the lure of how beautiful it is. But I think that's really just kind of the initial point of encountering this kind of medium. You know, people get bored of that. At some point, the next 2 years, 3 years, as soon as you start seeing more of it, it's like, okay, great, yeah, it's a point cloud and you're moving through the landscape. But then it's like, okay, well, what can you actually do with it? Why are you using this versus, say, a drone? You know, why are you scanning, or why are you using photogrammetry, where you could actually just be documenting real life footage? And I think those are some of the key critical questions to ask when you're investigating subject matter. What does this particular medium allow you to do that no other medium does? And I think that's when it becomes its most powerful. And in this particular project, you know, it was used because you can immediately understand that relationship between the above and below. Simple, but very effective for that subject.
Yeah, and it fits perfectly. Thank you.
There are no more questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'm now going to have a good sleep. Ciao.